One of the most confusing moments after walking away from a narcissistic relationship is realizing that the other person seems completely unaffected. You may expect tears, heartfelt apologies, or genuine reflection, but instead you often encounter silence, confidence, or even indifference. This reaction can leave you questioning everything. Did the relationship ever matter? Were your feelings real? Did they move on because they never cared? While every individual is different and not everyone with narcissistic traits responds in the same way, there is a common psychological pattern that often appears at the beginning of loss: denial. Denial is not simply refusing to acknowledge that someone has left. It is the mind's attempt to protect an inflated self-image from a reality that feels unbearable. For someone whose identity depends heavily on feeling admired, needed, or in control, accepting that another person has chosen to leave can feel like an attack on the very foundation of who they believe they are. This denial often begins long before they admit anything has changed. They convince themselves that your decision is only temporary, that you are acting emotionally, or that you simply need more time before returning. Instead of asking why the relationship ended, they may focus entirely on when you will come back. Their confidence is not always a sign of emotional strength. In many cases, it is a shield protecting them from a painful truth they are unwilling to face. Accepting that someone has truly walked away would require them to acknowledge that they no longer have complete influence over another person's choices. That realization challenges the image of superiority they have carefully built, so the mind searches for easier explanations. They tell themselves you are confused, you are trying to make them jealous, or you are teaching them a lesson that will eventually end. These explanations allow them to postpone facing the deeper reality that someone has decided life is healthier without them. For the person who has finally left, this stage can be incredibly frustrating. You may spend days or weeks gathering the courage to establish boundaries, only to discover that those boundaries are treated as though they do not exist. Your messages asking for space may be ignored. Your silence may be interpreted as a strategy rather than a final decision. Even your absence can be viewed as part of a game they believe they are destined to win. This is why many people feel as though they are not being heard. In truth, your words may be heard, but they are filtered through a mindset that struggles to accept any reality threatening its sense of control. Denial also reveals an important difference between love and possession. Healthy love respects another person's freedom, even when that freedom leads to painful separation. Possession assumes that the other person will always remain available. When someone believes they have permanent access to your attention, your emotions, or your forgiveness, your departure seems impossible. Instead of recognizing your decision as an expression of personal growth, they interpret it as a temporary interruption in a story they still believe they control. They are not responding to who you truly are in that moment. They are responding to the version of you they have created in their own mind, a version that always returns, always forgives, and always remains within reach. This denial is often reinforced by past experiences. If previous arguments ended with reconciliation, or if you repeatedly gave second chances after broken promises, they may assume history will repeat itself. Every time unhealthy behavior was tolerated in the past, it strengthened the belief that no consequence would ever be permanent. This is why your final decision may seem unbelievable to them. They are not only denying your current choice, they are relying on old patterns that convince them they never had to change because you would always remain. Breaking that cycle forces them to confront something they have avoided for a long time: the possibility that actions have lasting consequences. It is important to understand that denial does not necessarily mean the person feels nothing. Sometimes it means they feel too much and lack the emotional tools to process those feelings honestly. Rather than admitting disappointment, fear, shame, or vulnerability, they replace those emotions with certainty. Certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Confidence feels stronger than grief. Pretending everything is under control feels easier than admitting they no longer control the outcome. This defense mechanism allows them to delay emotional pain, even if only temporarily. During this stage, they may continue living as though nothing significant has happened. They may post cheerful photos, appear unusually confident, or speak about future plans that exclude any mention of the relationship ending. These behaviors can deeply wound the person who is left, creating the impression that years together meant very little. Yet appearances can be misleading. Public confidence is not always private peace. Many people use outward composure to avoid confronting uncomfortable emotions. What looks like emotional freedom may actually be emotional avoidance. One of the greatest mistakes people make during this stage is interpreting the narcissist's denial as evidence that leaving was the wrong decision. When your absence seems to have no immediate effect, doubt begins to whisper. You wonder whether your boundaries mattered. You question whether you exaggerated the problems. You even consider reaching out just to prove the relationship meant something. This is where emotional clarity becomes essential. Your decision to leave was not validated by how dramatically another person reacted. It was validated by your need for safety, respect, peace, and emotional health. Their inability or unwillingness to acknowledge your choice does not erase the reasons you made it. Staying committed to your decision during this phase requires tremendous courage because denial often creates the illusion that nothing has changed. But beneath that illusion, everything has changed. For the first time, someone has chosen self-respect over fear, boundaries over manipulation, and healing over emotional exhaustion. That decision may not be immediately recognized by the other person, but it marks the beginning of a profound transformation within you. While they struggle to accept a reality that challenges their need for control, you are learning to embrace a reality built on freedom, self-worth, and truth. The journey forward may not always feel easy, but every step away from denial, whether it is theirs or your own, is a step toward a healthier, more authentic life where your value is no longer measured by someone else's ability to recognize it. After denial begins to crack, something far more intense often rises to the surface: rage. This is the stage that catches many people off guard because the emotional tone can shift almost overnight. The same person who acted as though your absence meant nothing may suddenly become hostile, accusatory, or determined to make you regret your decision. It is important to understand that this anger is not necessarily evidence of deep love. More often, it is the response of a wounded ego that can no longer ignore the reality that it has lost influence over someone it expected to control. While every individual is different and not everyone with narcissistic traits reacts the same way, many display a pattern where emotional injury is expressed through blame, retaliation, or attempts to regain a sense of superiority. For someone who has built their identity around admiration, importance, or control, rejection is not processed in the same way a healthy person might process heartbreak. A healthy individual may grieve, reflect, and eventually accept the loss while respecting the other person's decision. A narcissistic mindset often interprets the same event as a personal insult. Instead of asking, "What happened to this relationship?" the question becomes, "How could someone do this to me?" The focus shifts away from mutual understanding and toward protecting a fragile sense of self. The emotional pain is real, but rather than examining it honestly, it is redirected outward in the form of anger. This is why you may suddenly become the target of accusations that seem disconnected from reality. You might hear that you were selfish, ungrateful, impossible to satisfy, or responsible for every problem in the relationship. These statements are often less about objective truth and more about relieving internal discomfort. Blaming someone else temporarily protects the ego from confronting personal responsibility. If everything is your fault, then there is no need for painful self-examination. The anger becomes a shield against accountability. In many cases, this rage is fueled by humiliation rather than heartbreak. Losing someone who chose to walk away creates an experience they cannot easily control or rewrite. The image they carefully maintain that they are always desired, always admired, always in command has been challenged. Even if no one else knows what happened, they know. That private awareness can feel deeply threatening. Instead of sitting with feelings of vulnerability, they attempt to restore emotional balance by convincing themselves that you were the problem all along. Anger becomes a way of reclaiming psychological power. Sometimes this rage is obvious. It appears through shouting, insults, harsh messages, or relentless criticism. Other times it is much quieter and more calculated. It may come in the form of silent treatment, passive-aggressive comments, deliberate attempts to provoke jealousy, or subtle efforts to undermine your confidence. Some individuals spread rumors or distort the story to mutual friends and family, hoping to protect their own image while damaging yours. Others may suddenly become unusually successful, generous, or charming in public, not because they have changed, but because they want to demonstrate that they are thriving without you. The specific behavior varies, but the underlying motivation is often the same: restoring a damaged sense of superiority. This stage can be especially confusing because the intensity of the anger may seem disproportionate to the situation. You may think, if they wanted me gone, why are they so furious that I left? The answer lies in the difference between choosing to let someone go and having someone choose to leave. In relationships marked by control, The narcissistic individual often expects to decide when the relationship begins, when it ends, and under what conditions. When you make that decision for yourself, you remove something they believe belonged to them, the power to define the relationship's future. That loss of control can trigger profound emotional instability. One of the most painful aspects of this stage is the temptation to defend yourself. When false accusations are made or your character is attacked, the natural instinct is to explain, argue, and prove your innocence. Unfortunately, entering that cycle often provides exactly what the angry person is seeking: continued emotional engagement. Every argument keeps the connection alive. Every defensive response confirms that they can still influence your emotions. This does not mean you should never clarify the truth when necessary, especially in situations involving legal matters, professional concerns, or protecting yourself from serious falsehoods. But in many personal interactions, endless attempts to convince someone who has already decided to misunderstand you rarely lead to peace. Another reason this stage feels so overwhelming is because anger can be unpredictable. One day they may send cruel messages filled with blame. The next day they may act as though nothing happened. They might alternate between hostility and unexpected kindness, creating emotional confusion. This inconsistency often leaves the other person emotionally exhausted, constantly wondering which version they will encounter next. Such unpredictability can make it difficult to maintain healthy boundaries because hope and fear begin taking turns influencing your decisions. It is also important to recognize that not all anger is loud. Some people express rage through withdrawal, coldness, or calculated indifference. They may refuse to acknowledge your presence, intentionally exclude you from important events, or act as though your existence no longer matters. While these behaviors appear calm on the surface, they can carry the same underlying purpose of punishment or control. Emotional distance becomes another method of communicating disapproval while avoiding direct vulnerability. For the person who has left, this stage often becomes an unexpected test of emotional resilience. It is easy to mistake another person's anger for evidence that you have done something wrong. You begin replaying conversations, questioning your decisions, and wondering whether you should have stayed longer or explained yourself better. But another person's inability to regulate their emotions does not automatically mean your boundaries were unfair. Healthy boundaries frequently provoke unhealthy reactions from people who benefited when those boundaries did not exist. There is also a deeper lesson hidden within this stage. Rage often reveals what someone values most. If respect, empathy, and mutual understanding were at the center of the relationship, those qualities would become visible even during painful endings. When control, image, and superiority take priority instead, those priorities often become unmistakable under the pressure of loss. Difficult moments rarely create character. They expose it. They reveal the habits, beliefs, and emotional patterns that were already present beneath the surface. Perhaps the most empowering realization is that you are no longer responsible for calming emotions that were never yours to manage. For too long, you may have believed that your role was to prevent conflict, absorb criticism, or sacrifice your own peace to preserve someone else's comfort. Walking away challenged that belief. Their anger may try to convince you that returning is the quickest way to restore peace, but lasting peace cannot be built on fear or constant emotional surrender. Real peace comes from knowing that another person's rage does not define your worth, dictate your future, or erase the courage it took to choose a healthier path. When anger fails to produce the reaction they expected, many narcissistic individuals shift into a far more subtle and calculated stage: manipulation. This phase is often the most emotionally confusing because it does not always look harmful on the surface. Instead of insults, there may be compliments. Instead of blame, there may be apologies. Instead of distance, there may be sudden affection and promises of change. To someone who has longed for accountability, these gestures can feel like the breakthrough they have been waiting for. But while every individual is different and not everyone with narcissistic traits follows the same pattern, manipulation frequently appears when direct control no longer works. The goal is often not genuine reconciliation, but the restoration of influence over the person who has chosen to leave. This stage is powerful because it targets your emotions rather than your logic. A narcissist who realizes that intimidation and anger have failed may begin appealing to your compassion, your memories, your sense of responsibility, or your hope that people can change. They understand, consciously or unconsciously, where your heart is most vulnerable. If you value loyalty, they remind you of your commitment. If you value forgiveness, they ask for another chance. If you value kindness, they present themselves as broken and helpless. They are no longer trying to overpower your boundaries. They are trying to persuade you to lower them voluntarily. One of the most common tactics during this phase is what many people describe as love bombing after separation. Suddenly, the person who seemed emotionally unavailable becomes attentive, affectionate, and deeply expressive. They send long messages, unexpected gifts, heartfelt apologies, or declarations that you are the only person they have ever truly loved. They may revisit cherished memories, reminding you of vacations, celebrations, or dreams you once shared together. None of these actions automatically prove manipulation because sincere people can also apologize and seek reconciliation. The difference lies in consistency and accountability. Genuine change is demonstrated over time through repeated actions, humility, and respect for boundaries. Manipulation, on the other hand, often focuses on creating immediate emotional impact without addressing the deeper patterns that cause the relationship to break down. Another common strategy involves making promises that sound exactly like what you have always wanted to hear. They suddenly agree to attend counseling. They promise they will communicate better, control their anger, become more supportive, or finally prioritize the relationship. Hearing these promises can awaken enormous hope because they echo conversations you may have had for months or even years. Yet hope without evidence can become a dangerous trap. Words are easy to offer when someone fears losing control. Sustained transformation requires personal responsibility, patience, and a willingness to accept consequences, even if reconciliation never happens. Manipulation during this stage often extends beyond romantic language. A narcissist may create situations designed to make you feel guilty for leaving. They might talk about how lonely they are, how their life is falling apart, or how no one understands them. Sometimes they exaggerate personal struggles or crises, knowing that your caring nature will make it difficult to ignore them. If you have spent years taking responsibility for their emotional well-being, these messages can trigger a powerful urge to rescue them once again. You begin wondering whether leaving was selfish, even if the relationship caused you constant pain. There are also situations where manipulation becomes more indirect. Rather than contacting you constantly, they may use mutual friends or family members to send messages. They may ask others to tell you how much they miss you or how devastated they have become. They may post emotional quotes on social media, hoping you will see them and feel compelled to respond. Sometimes they intentionally display dramatic changes in appearance, success, or lifestyle, hoping curiosity or jealousy will draw you back into communication. Every action is designed to reopen a door that was beginning to close. One of the most confusing aspects of this stage is the mixture of truth and deception. A narcissist may genuinely feel fear at losing someone important. They may sincerely experience loneliness, sadness, or regret in certain moments. These emotions can be real. However, experiencing emotion is not the same as developing emotional maturity. Someone can genuinely fear abandonment while still using manipulative behaviors to prevent it. This is why it is important to evaluate patterns rather than isolated emotional moments. Lasting character is revealed through consistent behavior, not temporary emotional intensity. Many people become trapped during this phase because they mistake emotional urgency for meaningful change. The relationship suddenly feels alive again. There are passionate conversations, emotional confessions, and dramatic promises. Compared to the silence or hostility that came before, this renewed attention can feel deeply validating. You may think, maybe this is the person they were capable of becoming all along. But emotional intensity is not the same as emotional health. A relationship built on cycles of crisis and rescue often creates dependence rather than genuine intimacy. Manipulation also works because it activates self-doubt. You begin questioning your memories. Perhaps things were not as bad as you remember. Maybe you expected too much. Maybe everyone has flaws. Maybe this time will really be different. These questions are natural because human beings generally prefer hope over loss. We want to believe that people can grow, relationships can heal, and painful endings can be avoided. Those desires are beautiful when paired with wisdom. Without wisdom, however, they can keep someone trapped in cycles that repeat over and over again. Another powerful tactic during this stage is selective accountability. The narcissist may admit to a few small mistakes while avoiding responsibility for the larger pattern of behavior. They apologize just enough to appear self-aware, but not enough to require genuine transformation. This partial ownership creates the impression of humility while protecting the deeper issues from meaningful examination. You hear the words, "I'm sorry," but you rarely hear sustained evidence that they understand how their actions affected your emotional safety and trust. This stage often reveals one of the greatest challenges in healing, learning to distinguish between potential and reality. Many people stay attached not to who the other person consistently was, but to who they occasionally appeared capable of becoming. They hold on to brief moments of kindness, vulnerability, or affection while overlooking the larger pattern of manipulation, criticism, and control. The heart naturally remembers hope, but healing requires remembering the whole story, not just its brightest chapters. As difficult as this stage can be, it also presents an opportunity for tremendous personal growth. You begin learning that compassion does not require abandoning your boundaries. You discover that forgiveness does not obligate reconciliation. You realize that caring about someone does not mean accepting behavior that continually damages your emotional well-being. Most importantly, you understand that genuine love never demands the surrender of your dignity in exchange for temporary peace. When your decisions become rooted in consistent truth instead of emotional pressure, manipulation gradually loses its power, and your confidence is no longer shaped by someone else's ability to influence your heart. As it becomes increasingly clear that you are not returning, another significant psychological shift often takes place. The focus moves away from trying to win you back and turns toward protecting their image. While every individual is different and not everyone with narcissistic traits behaves in exactly the same way, many become deeply concerned with how they are perceived by others once the relationship has ended. Losing your presence is painful, but losing the admiration, respect, or validation of the people around them can feel even more threatening. This stage is driven by a powerful desire to preserve an identity that appears confident, desirable, and blameless, even if doing so requires rewriting the story of the relationship. For many people, the end of a relationship is a private loss that is processed through grief, reflection, and eventually acceptance. For someone whose self-worth is closely tied to external validation, however, the breakup is not only an emotional event, but also a public one. They begin asking themselves questions that have little to do with healing and much more to do with reputation. What will friends think? What will family believe? How will coworkers view me? Will people assume I failed? Instead of focusing on personal growth, their energy often shifts toward controlling the narrative before anyone else has the opportunity to form an opinion. This is why you may notice that the story they tell others bears little resemblance to the reality you experienced. They may present themselves as the devoted partner who was suddenly abandoned without explanation. They may describe themselves as endlessly patient while portraying you as emotionally unstable, impossible to satisfy, or incapable of appreciating everything they supposedly did for you. The details often become selective. Moments where they were hurtful, controlling, or dismissive quietly disappear from the story, while isolated incidents involving your frustration or emotional reactions become the central evidence against you. By carefully choosing which pieces of the relationship to reveal, they create a version of events that protects their image while shifting responsibility elsewhere. One reason this strategy can be so convincing is that it often contains fragments of truth. Every relationship includes misunderstandings, arguments, and moments where both people make mistakes. A narcissist may take those genuine moments and remove them from their larger context. For example, they may describe one occasion when you raised your voice but omit months of criticism or manipulation that led to that breaking point. Without the full story, listeners naturally assume they are hearing an accurate account. This selective storytelling allows them to appear honest while avoiding meaningful accountability. For the person who has left, this stage can feel deeply unfair. After spending so much energy trying to preserve the relationship, you may suddenly find yourself defending your character instead. Mutual friends begin acting differently. Family members ask uncomfortable questions. People who once treated you warmly seem distant because they have already heard a carefully crafted version of events. The instinct to correct every misunderstanding becomes overwhelming. You want everyone to know what really happened. You want justice. You want your voice to be heard. Although that desire is understandable, this stage teaches one of the hardest lessons in emotional maturity. Not every false narrative requires your participation. There is an important difference between protecting your reputation and becoming consumed by the need to convince everyone of your innocence. Healthy people who genuinely know your character often recognize consistency over time. They evaluate actions rather than dramatic stories. Those who are determined to believe only one side may never be persuaded, regardless of how much evidence you provide. Constantly chasing approval from every observer can keep you emotionally tied to the very relationship you are trying to leave behind. Image protection also extends beyond conversations. Many narcissists become highly focused on appearances during this period. They may suddenly present themselves as happier than ever, more successful than ever, or more fulfilled than ever. Social media often becomes a stage where carefully selected moments create the impression of a perfect life. New friendships, expensive purchases, exciting trips, and smiling photographs can all become part of a carefully managed presentation. This does not necessarily mean every joyful moment is fake, but the timing and intensity often reveal a deeper need to communicate a message. I'm doing great without you. The goal is not always personal happiness. Sometimes it is simply maintaining the appearance of victory. Another common behavior involves quickly seeking public validation through new relationships or social attention. By appearing to move on rapidly, they attempt to reinforce the belief that they remain desirable and unaffected. They may introduce someone new unusually quickly or constantly mention how many people are interested in them. To an outside observer, this confidence appears impressive. To someone familiar with the emotional dynamics underneath, it often reflects an urgent need for reassurance rather than genuine emotional healing. True healing usually requires time, reflection, and personal responsibility. Constantly searching for external admiration rarely replaces the internal work that lasting growth demands. There's also an important psychological reason why image protection becomes so intense. Admitting fault threatens more than the memory of the relationship. It threatens the identity they have spent years building. If they accepted that their own behaviors contributed significantly to the loss, they would have to confront uncomfortable emotions such as shame, insecurity, regret, and vulnerability. Rather than facing those emotions directly, it often feels safer to create a version of reality where they remain the misunderstood victim or the flawless partner who simply encountered someone incapable of appreciating them. This stage can be especially difficult because it tests your confidence in your own experiences. When enough people hear the rewritten story, you may begin wondering whether your memories are accurate. You ask yourself whether you overreacted, whether you misunderstood events, or whether you really were responsible for everything that happened. This internal confusion is one of the greatest emotional costs of prolonged manipulation. It separates you from your own judgment and encourages you to trust someone else's version of reality more than your own lived experience. Healing requires rebuilding that trust. It means remembering that your experiences matter, even if someone else refuses to acknowledge them. It means understanding that accountability and blame are not the same thing. Every relationship involves two imperfect people, but recognizing your own imperfections does not require accepting responsibility for another person's repeated harmful choices. Healthy reflection allows you to learn from your mistakes without surrendering your identity to someone else's distorted narrative. Perhaps the greatest freedom available during this stage comes from realizing that your reputation is ultimately built by the consistency of your character rather than the volume of someone else's accusations. Stories can influence opinions for a season, but integrity has a remarkable way of revealing itself over time. People who live honestly, treat others with respect, and remain consistent in their values gradually establish credibility that no carefully crafted narrative can permanently erase. While someone else may devote enormous energy to protecting an image, you have the opportunity to invest that same energy into becoming the kind of person who no longer depends on appearances for a sense of worth, because genuine peace grows strongest when it is rooted in truth rather than performance.